Thank you everybody and welcome to our event today. Our event is focused on the cost of living pressures that we're all facing, but really through the lens of how do we achieve better wages and conditions at work. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I'm meeting on today. And I know we've got union members from right across the country in different places, but I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to urge the heed of our First Nations people who want our movement's support for a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution. Parliaments have made laws and failed policies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for centuries. A voice enshrined in the Constitution will give them a direct line to Parliament to give advice on laws and policies that directly affect them. Previous laws have often entrenched discrimination and disadvantage, such as forcing First Nations people to work for free or below legal minimum wages over 2 centuries. Our First Nations brothers and sisters deserve their voice to be respected and to be listened before laws and policies are made. And it's for that reason our union has committed to supporting the Yes campaign in the upcoming referendum. And I really would encourage you to join us in that campaign. So again, welcome. It is really wonderful to have so many of you here joining with us today. We are recording this first panel session of the meeting and it will be made available following the meeting. When we get to the Q&As, we're going to stop recording. That gives you some freedom to ask whatever you'd like to ask of our panelists. We've got members from right across the sector here today. We've got lots of you from industry super, banking and insurance. And I think that you're all here today because we all know that we're all feeling really acutely the brunt of cost of living and those pressures in our households. And many of you are here because you are actually smack bang in the middle of negotiations for a new collective agreement. And I want to call out in particular our members here from Australian Retirement Trust and the NAB because you in particular, both of you, have been at the table negotiating improvements to your wages and conditions for a long time. But I can also see on our list of attendees that we've got familiar faces here today from Australian Super, CBA and ANZ, IFS. Those particular campaigns, well, you're just starting off. And I think some of you are here because you've got pay negotiations and the collective agreement is coming up for you. So I think it's fair to say that whilst we might all be in different phases of our campaigns and we all come from different parts of the sectors and we've got different bosses who have different approaches, and I know that wherever we are in our campaigns, at times it can probably feel hard and drawn out and sometimes incredibly frustrating, and that makes us all a bit tired. But what I know one thing to be true. I know that despite the different phases or stages that your fight might be at, there's always one thing that remains true in every union fight, and that is when we come together, when we stick together, we always can achieve better results. One of the examples that really springs to mind right now is we've had a really long and protracted negotiation with Link Group. And after 14 long months, Link moved on their first and quite pathetic pay offers. And right now we have 5% on the table for this year. We are in a much better position today than where we were at the start of those negotiations. And we're right in the middle of engaging with our reps and our members about the latest shift that we've seen from Link. Our TWU super members, well, they won 8.5% over 2 years, 5% at Host Plus, which was backdated to the 1st of July 2020. Over the next 4 years, those workers are going to get a 16% increase. They're really good outcomes. At the end of last year, I wanted to also bring in a banking example here, but at the end of last year, BOQ, which is now BOQ and ME, and I know many of us here have a connection to ME Bank. Well, our members there put up a great fight and they rejected a really bad offer. And we had an overwhelming 65% of workers reject the offer at the ballot. And as a result of that, today we've got improved pay, guaranteed pay increases for workers who had never been covered by the collective agreement. Those high earners above 120 and through to 150,000, they now have a guaranteed pay coming their way, pay increase coming their way. All of the staff got to keep their RRR entitlements after an attempt by the boss to slash redundancy. They've got the right to request flexible work. There's many more improvements there that I could talk about at BOQ, but the point I really wanted to highlight was in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when sometimes it might feel just easier to take what's on the table so that we've got something coming through, this group of workers decided that they were going to stick together and actually fight for something better. And we've seen that. And I can tell you that the reps are feeling incredibly proud of their efforts. And the union's profile has really been lifted, especially in places like BOQ, where we had more organising to do there. So I think that while some of us might be smack bang in the middle of those trenches right now, I did want to start this meeting with some union wins, because I think we get those good outcomes when we're organised. We get those outcomes when more of us are in the union, and when, as I said, when we stick together and hold the line, even when sometimes it feels really hard to do that. So I wanted to kind of position this conversation that we're going to be having today through the lens of what it means to be a winning union and how we get those kinds of results. And we're going to hear a bit more about that today. But when I think back on how we got to this point, you know, we successfully navigated the GFC. I know that was some time ago, but since then we've seen these fluctuations in our economic environment. We've seen really low levels of inflation, which is now reaching highs that we haven't seen in a generation. Enormous increases in productivity in the finance sector, enormous record profits. You know, the one thing that hasn't been growing over this time, however, are our wages. We were told that we shouldn't expect higher wages when inflation was low, despite the healthy profits. Then we were told that we shouldn't expect higher wages when inflation is high, despite record profits. And I think companies haven't been told, and I'm sure Jim's going to comment on this, but you know, companies haven't been told to rein in their profits, but it's only workers that have been told that regardless of the economic conditions, good or bad, that we can't expect our fair share. You know, many of us here through COVID, well, we risked our health and safety to maintain essential services during the lockdowns. And the one thing I know everywhere we're going right now is that our members are talking to us about the unpaid overtime, more and more of it, the demands that are being placed on us by our bosses, unreasonable work demands, and the impact that those additional and excessive hours is having on our families. That is universal wherever we go. That's what our members want to talk to us about. So, you know, we're delivering these record profits, excellent returns for our fund members, but we're paying more for everything. And it's a really big problem. And that's why we're having this webinar today. We really want to be thinking about how we can get our fair share of that pie. Just this week, we've seen announcements already from the NAB yesterday and ANZ today. And by the time Westpac reports their interim results on Monday, 3 of our big banks are set to report a combined bumper profit of just over $11 billion. Now, don't forget, CBA reported its half year in February. That was $5 billion. So you can see that our half yearly results are incredibly healthy. And the profits and the growth of our industry super funds alone, that is a compelling case for an increase in real wages. Finance workers' wages have gone backwards. They've fallen back to 2015 levels, but we're delivering more with less resources. We're working harder, we're increasing our productivity, and the industry has well and truly rebounced, delivering these enormous profits. But finance workers' share of real world impact is seen just declining wages, right? So that's devastating that an industry that is as strong and healthy as ours, as profitable as ours, is fighting against workers getting a share in the wealth that they're generating. And we know our members are really at a point where they're making difficult choices between prescription medication for their families, fresh food on the table, or some of them are, you know, working at home in puffer jackets so they don't have to turn their electricity on. It's really real for us in our sector. And so we've invited 2 really good friends of the FSU to share with us their expert knowledge on why we're facing this problem in the economy and then what we can do about it. And our first speaker will be Dr. Jim Stanford. He is the economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. He spends his time between Sydney and Vancouver. He's quoted all the time in print and media on the matters as they relate to economic policy, innovation, jobs, and social policy. He is a good friend of the trade union movement, and it's so important for us to have smart people like Jim on our side. He's going to take us through the economic outlook. If you haven't heard from Jim present before, you're in for a real treat. He makes economic theory interesting and engaging and ultimately real, because it's our lives that are impacted by the conditions. So he's going to bring us back to the role that unions can play in delivering decent wages. With that economic picture that Jim's going to paint, we're then going to turn to Michele O'Neil, president of the ACTU. She was elected as president in 2018, and before that she represented workers in the textile, clothing and footwear industry. A fierce advocate, no one like her, the fiercest you've got going around at the moment for working people. She's led campaigns to win leading rights for workers throughout the clothing supply chain. So we can't wait to hear from Michele, and I have no doubt she's going to dip into her great experience as a trade union leader, give us the broader perspective about what working people are doing right across the country, across a range of different sectors as they fight the cost of living pressures. For now, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jim. Thanks very much.
Julia, thank you very much. That was amazing, very inspiring. I actually think you covered the core economics right there, Julia, in terms of the banks and how profitable they are and how workers just have to fight like hell to get their share of it. And that's exactly what we're up against. You've really nailed the economics. So, Julia, if this union leadership thing doesn't work out for you down the road somewhere, think about economics as another career. You're very, very on the right road there. You mentioned we get quoted in the media a lot, which is great. I'm very honored by that. A new one today. We are quoted today in the Reserve Bank's statement on monetary policy. This is a first for us. They put out this this report every 3 months or so about inflation and interest rates and where the economy is going. And they cited us and then, of course, tried to attack us because we've been highlighting the importance of corporate profits, including the bank profits you mentioned, in driving the inflation that is at the core of the cost of living crisis. So I did grow up in Canada, as you mentioned. I grew up in rural Alberta. And when I was a lad on the farm, my mama said to me, Julia, my mama said, Jim, when you throw something out in the dark and you hear a squeal, it means you hit the pig. And I would say that we hit the pig if the RBA of all places is devoting some of their space to trying to critique our arguments on profits. So it shows we're on the right track, and the union movement is on the right track as well by refusing to let our members be the scapegoats for a problem that our members did not create. This inflation has nothing to do with wages, and saying that we will tighten our belts and accept an erosion in our cost of living and our living standards to solve a problem that wasn't ours to create in the first place is absolutely wrong. This is where the union's demands for good wages, as you've cited at every table, Julia, are absolutely legitimate and important. So I am going to share a few slides here and run through some of the facts and figures of the inflation that we're fighting and how to fight for fair wages for our members at a very, very uncertain time. There's our website for the Center for Future Work. All of our research is up there, open access. My Twitter handle and the Center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to post from this presentation today if you'd like. I'm going to quickly cover, I know we're zooming because it's lunchtime and people have to get back to work, what's happening with inflation and where is it headed, who wins and who loses from inflation, just to provide a few more details on what Julia's already covered. The wrong solution to inflation, namely what the RBA is trying to do with these interest rate hikes, and then the importance of unions campaigning and organizing and bargaining to defend workers' wages. So the first bit, what's happening with inflation? So, well, we kind of forgot inflation for a couple decades. It was kind of low and generally quite predictable, around 2 or 3% a year. But then that all changed with the pandemic and then the reopening after the pandemic. And obviously, that was a historic catastrophe. Apart from the death and the illness and the fear that it caused, it also wreaked havoc in the economy. Supply chains were all disrupted. We had an energy price shock right following the pandemic after the war in Ukraine. And then we had companies that took advantage of all of that chaos and uncertainty to jack up the prices that they charge for things. And that ultimately is what the cause of the inflation was. It isn't workers that set prices. Okay, you don't go to Kohl's or Woolworths and think that it's the individual workers there who determine how much the food is going to cost. And the same goes for the products that your members sell, Julia. It's the employers, it's the companies that determine what the costs are, and the companies were driving inflation in the wake of those disruptive events of the pandemic. Now, many of those disruptions are gradually getting addressed and solved, including the supply chain problems, the transportation backlogs, even energy prices have come down. But now we have, in a way, another danger, which is the Reserve Bank is so obsessed with trying to get inflation down and make workers pay for it that they're jacking up interest rates. And we could face a so-called cure for inflation, namely a recession, which seems quite possible in coming months. That is actually worse than the disease. So this shows the surge in inflation that occurred in Australia after the reopening, after the initial lockdowns. Now, it seems that inflation has peaked at 7.8% in the December quarter, and now it's coming back down. So this is a good sign, but inflation is still very high. And this is what your union delegates are going to have to confront at the bargaining table. And now what we're seeing is we're seeing the Reserve Bank really aggressively increasing interest rates. They increased them 10 months in a row. Then they took 1 month off. I guess they were tired after 10 consecutive interest rate hikes. They took 1 month off in March, and then they've just increased them again, an 11th one for good measure. A little bit more icing on the cake. So 3.85% is their cash rate now. Of course, we all pay far more than that on mortgages and car loans and credit card bills. So the impact on households who are already trying to, as you said, Julia, choose between prescription drugs and groceries and heat, the money is getting sucked away on top of that by the extra interest payments to the banks. So it's no surprise that the banks are making money hand over fist. They are benefiting from this very one-sided RBA policy. So inflation did slow down a bit in the March quarter, and in the month of March, the ABS, the Bureau of Statistics, has two different measures. One comes out every quarter and one comes out every month. The monthly one shows an even further deceleration in inflation to 6.3%. So this is good, but inflation is still too high, well above the RBA's target band. And even the RBA, with this tough medicine, is expecting inflation in the 5 to 6% range through all of the next year. And whether this works or not is very much up in the air. We could have another oil price shock, for example, if there's war somewhere in the Middle East, or if OPEC decides to jack up prices. We could see a banking collapse. We've seen some signs of that already. So hard to say exactly where it's going, but the pain that your members are experiencing is real and is shared by millions of other workers in Australia. Very important to think through who's winning and who's losing from this. And workers and wages get so much attention from the RBA. Philip Lowe and the others at the RBA are always standing up and worrying about wages growing too quickly. How can you say that wages are growing too quickly, Dr. Lowe, when for the last 2 years straight, the rate of growth of wages has been way below the rate of growth of prices? So the most recent data shows 3.3% gain at the end of 2022 for average wages. Your members, Julia, are doing better than that, and that's tribute to their solidarity and their determination. But for workers as a whole, they're lagging still well behind prices. And when your wages don't grow as much as your prices, you don't have to have a degree in economics to know that you're poorer at the end of the day. Even though your income in dollars might look higher, it can't buy what it used to buy. And that's what's behind the cost of living crisis that we're experiencing in Australia. So different measures of wages, some better than others, but none of them show that workers are keeping up with prices. Last year, on average, prices in Australia grew 6.6%. Across the full year, not just the peaks and valleys. And they grew more than that for the necessities that workers have to buy, like food and energy and housing. So that means the real purchasing power of workers fell on average by about 3.5% last year. Not many people got wages to keep up with inflation. The CEOs did, though, including the bank CEOs. they're managing just fine because they've got the power to line their own pockets. And this is the problem underlying the crisis in living standards. Real wages are going back in time. This is the real wage, the average wage in Australia adjusted for inflation. And it looks like we'll be back to where we were in 2008. So, this is like taking away 15 years of slow, painful progress. It was hard work trying to get any increase in real wages at all over the last 15 years. And now, in the blink of an eye, we're losing that to inflation unless we can stand together and demand that we get protected. At some point, it's not even enough to say wages should grow as fast as inflation. That's immediately what we have to say. Yes, we have to keep up with inflation, but then we have to do more. And now and in the future, we have to more than keep up with inflation because we've got to make up for those past losses. And any members of the union whose contracts have been in place for the last, say, 3 years, they experienced real wage losses during those 3 years. So we have to not just keep up with current inflation, we have to make up for that past erosion of real spending power. And that means profit margins, which are at record highs, are going to have to shrink. And there's no better place for those profit margins to start shrinking than with the banks, because they literally are profiting from the hardship of Australian households paying so much in interest costs. Still amazing on one level that the Reserve Bank and others still point to workers as the cause of inflation. It is companies. This is a shocking fact. It's companies that set prices, and they haven't just been passing on higher costs that they pay for their own inputs, particularly in any sector where the companies are big and powerful and have strategic influence. They're more than passing on higher costs. They're increasing their profit margins. It's more of a profit price spiral, not a wage price spiral that we're experiencing. And it's about time that the policymakers at least confronted the evidence that we've shown and other economists have shown about the role of profits in driving inflation. And then for workers, the lesson is clear. Workers have to exert their organized power to try and protect themselves amidst this. This shows the profit price spiral in action. This is the share of Australia's GDP that goes to corporate profits, and it has doubled since the early 1970s and reaching all-time record highs. So this idea that we're all hurt by inflation, we're all in the same boat, absolutely wrong. Banks, energy companies, supermarkets, property developers have never had it better, and we're paying for their success in the form of prices for the essentials of our life that we cannot afford. I want to talk a little bit about the dangers ahead because of this very knee-jerk anti-worker response that we're getting to inflation from the Reserve Bank. They have a view, believe it or not, this sounds insane, but it's what they think, that too many Australians have a job. Okay, so for our entire lives, we've been told, get off your butt and go and get a job. And now, because the unemployment rate is relatively low by historic standards, it's not zero. We aren't at full employment, but it's lower than it used to be. Now the Reserve Bank is saying too many of you have a job, and that's what the problem is. And again, they are now of the view that we have to stifle growth, slow down job creation, and actually increase unemployment. They have a funny word called NAIRU. That's a bizarre acronym, NAIRU. It means non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And they think we have to get the unemployment rate back up to 5%, maybe 6%. I don't know. And that means throwing hundreds of thousands of people out of their jobs. And this is their solution to the problem. It's very, very unfair, and it ignores the role of big companies, including banks, in driving that inflation in the first place. They hope that they can just ease the economy into a slower growth position, a so-called soft landing. What's more likely is that we'll have an actual recession. We've never had a situation where interest rates increased this much, this fast, without having a recession, in which case we'll see hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs. And this, again, is a reason why the union movement, Michele and Sally and the ACTU have been so out front, arguing for a different approach to managing inflation, rather than risking a recession in the whole economy. We have been so dependent on consumers to recover from the recession we had during the COVID pandemic. In fact, more than 100% of our total growth has come from consumers. This shows the growth in the last year of our total GDP at the top, and hardly anything happening in trade and business investment and even government programs. All the action has been on consumers who were pent up, had lots of pent up demand after the lockdowns and went out spending. The problem is that consumer spending is running out of steam. And we have seen zero growth in consumer spending, even in nominal dollar terms, in the last 6 months. And in real terms, adjusted for the fact that everything is more expensive, that means consumer spending is contracting. This is why we face a serious risk of a recession this year unless the Reserve Bank adopts a more balanced approach. Another consequence of high interest rates, and this is important for your members, Julia, is the instability that it will cause in the financial system. We have already seen 5 bank collapses in the last 2 months. That slide should say 2 months, not 2 weeks. 4 of them in the US and 1 of them in Switzerland. The bank collapse in Switzerland was huge. Credit Suisse, one of the biggest banks in the world. So this is where the banks, even though they're immensely profitable, in some ways are still very fragile because of the leverage and the speculation that goes into their operations. Very interesting to see how quickly governments ride to the rescue of the banks whenever they have a hard time. In fact, you've never seen a greater, a greater scandal, frankly, than the bailout of the Credit Suisse operation in Switzerland. UBS, the bigger bank in Switzerland, got to buy Credit Suisse, which has a $1.4 trillion worth of assets. That's a big bank, paying only $4.5 billion and not real money either, their own shares. So they are about to, UBS in the next weeks is going to declare the biggest profit in world history when they book the profit that they are going to make from this fire sale takeover of Credit Suisse. And this is just another example of how the government has 2 sets of rules. Where workers are concerned, when there's tough times, you just got to tighten your belt and swallow it. When business is concerned, then the regulators and the RBA and others will ride to the rescue of powerful banks. Let me conclude, Julia, just by reinforcing the economic importance of what your union is doing, and that is fighting for your members to defend their wages and their living standards. I do want to refer to a great paper that the ACTU put out that showed a much fairer strategy for trying to manage inflation rather than squeezing workers through real wage cuts and monetary austerity, monetary tightening and high interest rates. We should have regulations that limit the price pressures coming from strategic commodities like energy, like housing, like mortgages. We have to have fair taxes that redistribute excess profits from the banks and other super profitable companies to help the rest of us deal with the cost of living. We have to have support for protecting real wages and real incomes. We need to invest in housing and energy and infrastructure so that we have less supply restrictions in the economy. We have to have a little patience to get inflation back down, rather than thinking it has to happen right now, whether we have a recession or not. As long as we protect workers and low-income households against the impacts of inflation, we can handle it for a while. But protecting our real wages is the vital bit. And our challenge is to, first of all, explain to our members wages are not the problem. We cannot let our members internalize the argument that somehow it's wrong to go out and demand a higher wage because that's going to make inflation worse. Absolutely not. Our wages had nothing to do with inflation. And we have to keep bargaining for wages that not only keep up with inflation now, but that also make up for the losses, the real wage losses that our members experienced over the last couple of years, and reject the RBI's one-sided solution. So we play a vital role. The union movement is a legitimate, constructive, positive institution in society, and we're doing a good thing when we say, no, we will not accept real wage cuts to solve inflation that we didn't cause. No society has ever achieved what you would call inclusive prosperity without the power of unions to stand up and represent our members' interests in that way. And we cannot accept the argument that we're somehow greedy or irresponsible or inflationary by simply demanding that wages keep up with the inflation that we're experiencing. Julia, I give your delegates and your negotiators a full vote of confidence from the economic world that you are doing the right thing. You're not just helping your members, you're helping our economy when you go out and win wage increases that keep up with inflation. Your members are the ones who produce the real services that make our economy run and that make the banks successful, not the speculators and the financiers, but your members. And workers didn't cause this crisis, and we should refuse to be the scapegoat. So good luck in your negotiating. You've got moral righteousness on your side. Thank you.
I think what you've done is you've outlined the challenges in the economy, what we're facing, but just in that those final remarks, actually, it's not workers that are the problem. We are not to be blamed for this crisis, but rather we can be part of the solution for how we can continue with those moral fights that you've just outlined. So I think it's a perfect introduction for Michele to come in and take us through some of her perspective, what she can see as the president of the ACTU in terms of how other unions and other workers are fighting for their own cost of living increases. So thanks, Michele, over to you.
Great to join you this afternoon, everyone. I also want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay all my respects to elders past and present. It always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. And I also want to take the opportunity to express the ACTU's support, heeding the call of First Nations people for a voice to Parliament enshrined in our Constitution. And having the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listened to and respected in Parliament is key to improving the lives of First Nations people. And the whole of the union movement is proudly committed supporting the Yes campaign in the upcoming referendum. So as you've heard, we are facing a crisis. We're facing a cost of living crisis, and the average worker today is about $3,000 worse off than they were a year ago. And that's due to all the things that Jim has, in his very effective, more effective communicator, economist that I've ever come across, really, explained to you. But that it's due to a combination of things. But primarily it's low wage growth, and we've seen that rocketing inflation that have been behind this. But not everyone's been doing it tough. Company profits were up 28.5% in the last 12 months, and CEO pay 41.6% in 2021. And the banks, of course, their combined after-tax profits for the big four was $30.673 billion in the year to September last year. That was up $3.64 billion from the previous year. And at the beginning of this year, Goldman Sachs forecast that the banking sector was likely to record combined cash profits of $35.5 billion this financial year, and a 20% increase in earnings. So, like I said, not everyone's doing it tough. But what we know is that workers' wages are going backwards in real terms now because inflation is high, but that follows a decade of wages being stagnant. We haven't seen real wage growth for over 10 years. And this is a really out of whack system. When you see profits growing up, productivity going up, CEOs getting their obscene pay, and ordinary workers just not getting the benefit of the hard work that we're putting in. So there's something fundamentally wrong with this system. And workers' share of national wealth is now at its lowest level ever in our country. And this is true across the board, but it's particularly true for women workers. And women, the gender pay gap has continued to stubbornly refuse to really fall in any significant way. And I know for you in the finance sector that you have one of the biggest gender pay gaps across all sectors and industry. And also, of course, the other thing that's really impacting on workers around the country is insecure work. So 1 in 3 workers are in insecure jobs. And if you don't know if you're going to have hours of work or a shift tomorrow or even a job tomorrow, then it gets so much harder to be able to organise together with other workers to win a pay rise. The wage crisis is real. We've got that 7% inflation and it's nearly double that of wage growth, real wages going backwards. And what that means in practice for workers is if you look at essential items, which working people spend more of our income on than others do, the richer you are, the less a proportion of the income you spend on essentials, basically. It's plunged many workers and their families into poverty, and it is really terrible, wicked choices about whether you give your kids fresh fruit and veggies or fill up the car to get to work. No choice that should have to be made in Australia in 2023. And that fall in real wages that workers are facing is being really exacerbated by this. So essential items such as medical and hospital services have gone up 4.2%, gas and other household fuels 14.3%, and rents have gone up 4.9%, which is the highest annual rise since 2010. So we're just having this enormous financial stress and way too long to wait to see wages really starting to go up. And, you shouldn't have to skip meals, skip going to the doctor or the dentist or paying your fuel bills in a country like Australia. So what we want to see, of course, is wages start to go up, and we want to see better conditions for workers. And we know that all of the things that Jim's taken us through and that I've touched on as well are things that are partly because we've had structural inequality built into our system. And a decade of the Morrison government made this worse, where they deliberately set about a strategy that increased inequality, that was really in the interest of big business and not in working people, rolled back rights and conditions for workers and for our unions, and made it harder for us to bargain and jobs more insecure. That's the legacy that they left, let alone, of course, ignoring the very real demands of women for changes in things like introducing safer workplaces and ending sexual harassment at work. So great to know that one of the wins we've had in the last 12 months is that we want a change of government. And I'm not one of those people that says there's anything magic about changing a government that then automatically delivers for working people. What I know from my life as a unionist is that it's always about the struggle. It's always about organising. It's always about the work you do to win change. And you can never just rely on a parliamentary party, even when it's a better party that is more committed to the rights of working people to deliver. It's the work we do as unionists in organising and fighting for change that delivers the real change. And we have seen some big changes since the election. We saw that 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave for every worker, more than a decade of campaigning to win that, a massive win in our new laws, those better bargaining laws that were so overdue. So being able to bargain in a way where we don't just have to bargain workplace by workplace, where we can look at more and different ways of bargaining, sometimes by enterprise, sometimes by multi-enterprise bargaining, is going to make a real difference. Having better rights to how we bargain is just critical to changing the power imbalance. Also, really important changes about having secure work and gender equality as part of the objects of the law now. Your really important role of your union in winning that change that's got rid of pay secrecy clauses, and congratulations for the massive effort you put into us having that win for every worker. And of course, better pay equity laws, trying to make sure that we've got laws that mean that we can stop the historic undervaluation of work that's mainly done by women. There's more that we need to win. That was a great series of wins that we saw last year, but we're ambitious for more wins this year. We want to see changes that mean that wage theft is outlawed. We want to see changes to the rights of casual workers to make sure that bosses can no longer just call you a casual regardless of the reality of your working life. So proper recognition of how many jobs are really permanent but paid as casuals. Something about same job, same pay, that use of contracting and labour hire to undercut what we win and in paying conditions, so that workers who work alongside each other should get the same pay. They're just some of the things we're fighting for this year. But I also wanted to touch on, Julia, what has been happening around the country when workers come together. And what I know, as well as knowing that you don't automatically win when you change a government, what I know is that the things that matter and that are lasting are the wins we have when we organise together. And there's some key principles about that. It's about workers joining together. You know, sometimes I listen to things on the radio or the television and I hear people say, oh, this is how you go and ask for a pay increase. Well, I don't know. I think they're just refusing to acknowledge what we know about history. Individuals asking for pay increase does not deliver change in wages. What it may deliver, the odd individual in the odd company or the odd sector may get an advantage out of that. But if we want to see real change in workers' wages, it happens collectively. It happens when workers stand together. It happens when the balance of power is put back more in the hands of working people. Individuals are just that. One person alone is that alone. It's that coming together in a union that really is the evidence-based proof that that's what delivers wage increases. Don't just believe me. Ask people like Jim. That's the evidence that it's when workers organise, unionise and then bargain together that you see wages lifting. So, and of course, it's not just wages. What we know is that there's a whole lot of issues that really matter to workers that we can bargain around as well. And there's been a lot of great campaigns happening around the country on that. I want to just acknowledge that today we've had a massive win with an announcement from the federal government of the new National Energy Transition Authority, which is a win that unions who represent workers in the fossil fuel industry, in the coal industry and other industries that are being massively impacted by the absolute essential change that we have to make towards renewable energy and reducing emissions in Australia. They've had a win to make sure that there'll be a transition authority that supports workers through that change, make sure that this is not just left to the market, that we recognise and acknowledge that contribution that those workers have made and give them opportunities to have the skills and training and new jobs in the new energy economy as well. So that is an example, like the paid family and domestic violence leave, both campaigns that were more than 10 years in the making. Nothing that happened overnight, but workers seeing what was needed, joining together and being smart and strategic about going about winning it. And also, of course, often winning it first in bargaining agreements. So both those examples, you'll see, around the country that we won paid family and domestic violence leave. You did in many agreements, agreement by agreement. And then it was that force of so many agreements being won that led us to being able to win the universal right for every worker. Similarly, with the Transition Authority, those unions won individual companies committing to have a transition plan. Not every time, and way too many workers were left behind, but they built the argument, they bargained for it, they fought for it and won it, and now they've won an overall authority. So we've seen workers around the country fighting for wage increases in early childhood education and care. Childcare workers, some of the most undervalued workers in the country, they've been winning pay rises for early childhood educators and doing that by sticking together and organising not just the workers in that sector, but organising with the parents as well, because a whole lot of parents were seeing the impact of children having this rotating door of educators who just couldn't afford to stay in a job that they loved. So they've done some really exciting bargaining where they've won wage increases, a lot more to do, but done it through campaigns where workers have taken stop work action and they've been supported in that strike by the parents of the children that they're educating. Really important public message to the employers and the government that this is a broad and supported campaign. We've also seen some good agreements won in the higher education sector, where it's not always been about wage increases, they have been important, but also about things like at the University of Sydney, for example, winning that casual academics are entitled to sick leave for the first time. So this is a sector where there's been huge casualisation, and they've now won in their agreement by sticking together and fighting for it, that casuals also get entitled to sick leave. This is a big change about unions getting better and making sure we organise all workers. It used to be a bit of a tendency that we'd think about what do we need to win for permanent workers, and now thinking about what do we need to win for every worker and trying to organise collectively to bring every worker into our bargaining. We've also seen some good wins in agreements where more commitments to turn casual roles into permanent roles. Again, Western Sydney Uni, a great example of that, but many around the country where there's been that approach of having guaranteed transition out of casual work into permanent work included in agreements. We've seen some fight backs against some really nasty employers that were trying to terminate agreements. And one of the good changes in the law we got last year was to stop this sort of threat. But Spitzer, which is the operator of tugboats, biggest tugboat operator in the world, we're trying to cancel the agreements of the MUA and the other maritime unions, really as a weapon, a threat. Like, you want a wage increase? You're not only not going to get a wage increase, we're going to take you backwards to the award. A terrible, vicious part of the law that I'm pleased to see has now changed. But those unions stuck together, had a big campaign, including industrial action, to fight it off. So there's some examples, but what I want to end with, Julia, is this, is that what we know is the ways that we win is there's some simple truths, isn't it? It's about when we organise. When we're bargaining, it's about unity. Everything we can do to try and build that unified position of members, because you know so well the danger of companies trying to drive division amongst workers. About being both smart and strategic about what we're claiming, how we do it, how we make the message one that works for workers, but also the general public, is something we are good at, but are getting better at as well, and is a really important part of putting pressure, particularly on companies that love their brand. And many of your, the organisations you work for, they really love their brand. And also, of course, being prepared to take action. And when I say that, I don't mean always strike action. Of course, fundamentally, withdrawing your labour is a really important right and capacity for workers to do. But knowing that you can build action, and it might start with small things that build the support and confidence of members, leading, if necessary, to strike action if you need to go there. But starting with all types of different action that can be online, in person, ways of stopping, ways of meeting, ways of getting your voice heard, that build the confidence for people then ultimately to say, no, if this is not good enough, we're going to take action to make sure we win it. So, Julia, I'm going to end there saying your union has so many great examples that you started off with. All credit to you, and thanks for the time today.
Oh, thanks so much, Michelle. It's wonderful to hear you acknowledge the work that we're doing, but equally to see the solidarity across the sector, and to hear those really powerful stories. Our wharfies, our childcare educators, our academics in universities. It really does give us inspiration and hope for the things that we want to keep doing. When we're right in the middle of the fight, or as we're getting ready for the battles that are coming for us.